Hello, I'm Joseph Federle. I'm an editor here at WHAS, and I've always liked the history of the place. And I was reading in this here, one of the cool things about the history of our stations that I saw in this cool book from the 1950s is this photograph with Robert Whitney. He was the first conductor of the Louisville Orchestra. So every time the current conductor of the Louisville Orchestra, Teddy Abrams, is on the show, whether it be the noon show or Great Day Live, I'm always trying to talk to him, and we always have great conversations before and after the interview. So I said to him, why not just sit down and let's spend 10 or 20 minutes together and talk about all sorts of stuff. It was a great conversation we had. We talked about what got him inspired and what his passion was to start being a musician, and my favorite composers and his favorite composers. We had a great time talking about everything under the sun that had to do with music. What is one of the things that got you into music? How old were you when you first started appreciating it?
Well, I started playing music when I was about 3 years old, 3 or 4, and it was just on the piano at home, and really just because we had one. I'm sure it was there and it looked like fun, and any kid wanted to go over and bang on the piano. I think that's actually an important part of how kids are attracted to it. They find it on their own.
Right.
And you can't force a kid to love music. They have to come to it.
For anything.
Yeah, same thing with clarinet. I started when I was 8, and it was the exact same thing. My parents did not pressure me into doing it at all. It was an option for school band, 3rd grade band, and I signed up the day that it came out. As soon as they said, you want to be in the band, I said, absolutely, 100%, want to play the saxophone. And they said, no saxophone for you, your hands are too small. Clarinet is the closest thing, you want to do that? And I thought, well, sounds good to me. I don't know anything about the clarinet. I was lucky I chose that because clarinet's much more compatible with orchestral music. Saxophone doesn't have a big role in the orchestra.
Yeah. Well, one of the great things about you is you're versatile. I mean, I saw you Saturday night playing the piano. And you were actually, I don't know how you were doing it, you were doing a good job of actually composing or conducting and playing the piano at the same time.
Yeah, you kind of learn how to do that. I've done that a bunch. I've played the clarinet with the orchestra. One of the reasons I play the instruments with the orchestra is that it keeps you really honest. If you don't actually play an instrument as a conductor, how are the musicians going to trust you? It's kind of like being a coach. If you'd actually played the basketball or baseball or something like that in the pros, the players are going to trust you because they know that you know what you're talking about.
I've heard people say a good management sign is someone who will never ask their employee to do something they wouldn't do themselves.
That's right. Yeah, that's why I do it. It keeps me honest, and it also keeps the relationship on a musical level so that all the musicians can relate to me just as musician to musician. I think that's actually really important, that a conductor is not just some figure floating above like a balloon untethered to anything. It's easy to get a big head also as a conductor, and playing the music keeps you honest.
And getting a big head, it stifles your creativity.
It certainly does, and you have to remember that the challenge of playing an instrument is immense. Being able to execute like any of our members of the orchestra on the violin, the tuba, the percussion, the clarinet, whatever it is, at that level is a finesse like an Olympic athlete. Every single one of our musicians is able to perform at the absolute highest level, and you have to have a tether to that. That's part of the act of experiencing live music, is remembering just how perfectly, pristine. Yeah, it's very special.
Well, that's the way it was Saturday night. In engineering, they look at birds and they look at their wingspan and they see how they can make that to an airplane. They can, I think it was a woodpecker. It's got a type of, it protects the brain. They try to, a frog's tongue. All these things have been looked at in engineering. And I'm sure music is the same thing. There's certain parts where it had to be inspired by a bird. How much do you think of good music composition is from nature?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. Music is kind of a language unto itself, so it can refer to things in nature, like a flute, obviously very famously captured in Peter and the Wolf. Each of the instruments has an animal that's connected with it, but on the other hand, music also just exists completely separate from any specific reference. So I often say, if you listen to a C major chord and you had to describe it, there are not specific words. It may feel kind of happy-ish, or it may feel like that's maybe a kind of a cloudy version of a chord, or it may be a nostalgic chord. But all those words are just approximations. Music gets to a deeper kind of relationship with human communication. It goes to the place beyond the words, and that's why I think the music that we play is universal and it's also eternal. It's not limited to just one place or one time. It's the thing that makes it most powerful, that a person listening to a composition 300 years ago in Leipzig, when Bach was playing it for the very first time, will have the same experience with that music that you might take to Venezuela today. And it doesn't make a difference their background or their language of spoken words. It only matters that the music is something that you're open to, and you're gonna have a genuine experience with it.
Well, speaking of music that has nothing to do with nature, I know that Jerry Goldsmith is one of the film composers I like a lot, because he has a really good effect of making sounds that you're not used to hearing in scores. It's certainly not natural. What are some of your favorite film scores? And the great thing about Teddy is I've talked to him so many times, and he doesn't look down on people who just know music scores from films, or because you understand music's music, and it's very opening. So what are some of the film composers you like?
Well, and what's fascinating is that the history of film composers is very connected to the history of orchestral music.
Right.
In fact, some of the greatest of the older world film composers, the people that were writing at the very first time that films had music attached to it.
Max Steiner.
Max Steiner, Alfred Newman, all these
all
people. Alfred was kind of the head of the patriarch of the Newman family, and of course now we have famous ones like Randy Newman and Thomas Newman, who are some of my favorite film composers. But Alfred was taking the techniques of the great composers from Germany and Austria. Many of them were Jewish, and they escaped from the Holocaust. Korngold, Eric Korngold, was one of my favorite composers. He was a prodigious talent. When he was 12 years old, he'd already written an opera, and he had to flee the Holocaust. So he came to America, and of course, we didn't need as many new operas as the Viennese needed. So he started looking for work, and of course, he started working in the film world. So Korngold is one of the great film composers of the mid-century.
What
and
are
of
some
course,
of the films he's done?
Oh, there were a number of them that most people probably wouldn't recognize so much, but if you have a knack for films from the 40s and 50s, you might encounter a few of them. But a lot of them, they're not the ones that are quite as famous. Not like Gone with the Wind. But Max Steiner and Newman had more that are really recognized today.
Newman, I think he was the head of 20th Century Fox, right? Their entire musical division.
Oh yeah, he did a ton of those. Yeah, and that's where people would recognize. So if you liked, some of those old Billy Wilder movies, those scores are absolutely incredible. And that tradition got passed down to the composers that we listen to today, and of course John Williams is at the head of that. But it all goes to the modern era. Composers like Ludwig Göransson, who is an incredible talent, come from that same tradition. And it's really wonderful to know that those connections are there between the composers of the mid-century, and a few of the kind of classical composers even had a hand in it. Like Aaron Copland, for instance, wrote wonderful music to a number of movies that were award-winning. He did both, and sometimes you still see that kind of relationship. A few of my friends, the composer that we played actually on Saturday night, Adam Schoenberg, has written and won an Emmy, and the composer Mason Bates also has written for the film world, and so he's a composer that we have performed here frequently on the stage.
Have you ever thought of that?
film? Well, I've never actually done one. It's a big process. You have to commit a lot of time to it. It's funny because you have to spend a lot of time working on the piece, but when it comes time to actually getting everything together, that process can go very quickly. Because the production schedules don't often align with your performance schedules.
Or the opposite's true. You could have a whole number of a sequence that's going to be dropped on the editing floor, and you just have to adapt to that.
Yeah, and it moves quickly. And a lot of times you'll be in the room and you'll have to edit things during the actual. It's fascinating to watch.
Oh yeah, I mean every time I see John Williams in front of an orchestra doing, I think that just last night they had a whole special about the Galaxy's Edge. Theme park area at Disney World, and of course they had a sneak peek of John Williams. He actually composed music originally for the theme park, which is cool.
But what we do, is very similar, and so the music that you hear at any of our concerts has a story. It connects with the very emotions that are the reason we have music in film, because that music is needed. If you take the music out, the films often become completely almost meaningless, or just really empty. So,
well, this is the reason why I like this interview so much is because if you look here, this is the original conductor of the Louisville Orchestra, Robert Whitney, and he's being interviewed by a WHAS employee. This is actually singer-composer Tom Scott. We actually had a musical director here at WHAS, so this is really neat to be continuing the tradition, interviewing the Louisville Orchestra conductor. Now, you are also pretty famous for composing your own items. Like how many scores have you done here at the Louisville Orchestra that you've written yourself?
Well, I think we're at about 4 different commissions, or that we call them commissions, but I actually see composing as part of my job because I think every conductor should also be a composer. Right. The history of conductors is tied to the history of composers. People like Mahler and Beethoven and Brahms were all composers and conductors. Right. And so I've written a piece that we actually played on my very first concert here. That was called the Overture in Sonata Form, kind of a silly title, but that was my very first piece that opened up my very first season. And then the large-scale Muhammad Ali kind of oratorio rap opera that I wrote a couple of seasons ago. Then a big long song cycle that I wrote last year called Song of the River, actually about the Ohio River. And a piece called Fanfare. It was a Kentucky Royal fanfare written for Prince Charles when he came to visit. So actually, there's a fun little group of compositions that have been composed just for us.
And you're right. I mean, if you're able to look at a conductor, that's part of it. I mean, you're not just doing this all the time. And I also wanted to ask you, I was there Saturday, and there are certain parts in, of course, by the way, I loved the soprano, the 2 violinist solos. I mean,
yes.
Everybody is so phenomenally great. Who is the person you had at the Bernstein 100 celebration last year? It was the singer who sang I Can Cook.
Yes, Morgan James.
She was phenomenal. Is she going to come back this year?
Well, I actually think she is coming back. I don't know if we have announced it yet, but in November. Did we announce that? Yeah, she's coming back on November 9th. I can't wait to hear her. Yeah, we're doing a special performance out at Ashburn Farms.
Oh, really?
Which is such a beautiful and special location. So I wanted to go make sure the orchestra had a relationship with them because that's classic Kentucky right there. And so we're going to do another celebration, not of Bernstein this time, but of Gershwin. So that's something to go out and see.
I've got to go. I love Gershwin.
Yeah.
Summertime.
Yeah, we're definitely doing Summertime. Yeah, so some of his best known and most famous songs. And what's really cool is that not only do we do some of the original arrangements, like Summertime, we do the actual version that was performed in Porgy and Bess that Gershwin wrote. Right. We also do a number of arrangements that were created just for Ella Fitzgerald. And those are some of the most classic, beautiful, lush, mid-century versions. And we have those arrangements. We actually found the original versions of them, and Morgan sings them with the orchestra.
That's
pretty special. Yeah.
Now, Gershwin, do you think that people who love Gershwin have a favorite airline?
Well, I don't know if they like hearing it in United, but of course, yeah, United's.
I mean, that's the funniest part.
I hear it all the time.
That speaks to the power of music. I mean, something you've heard over and over, and it transports you to a place and a time, and it just reminds you of your youth or whatever else, whether it be a television jingle or a United Airlines jingle.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's what I love. And most of the time, it's orchestral music, and that's the best that stays. I think we look at the media, and a lot of people say newspaper readerships are down. A lot of traditional things that are stalwarts of society are not doing as well as they had. Don't you think that the orchestra will always be around? Because there's just something powerful about always sitting in there. I mean, I was there Saturday, and it was packed, and everybody just loved to hear. And there's nothing like hearing, I'm showing my, I don't know, the soprano sang the famous about the dun 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 dun. What is that?
Oh, the habanero.
Habanero. Yes, there's nothing like hearing something you've heard snippets of your whole life, and to hear it in the form that it was composed for.
That's right. Yeah, I do think the orchestra is going to be around as long as there are people with open ears. Right. And it's hard to maintain an orchestra. An orchestra is a complex organism, and every one of our musicians is a full-time employee of the orchestra. They are not doing this just casually. They are the best of the best. When we have auditions, people come from around the world to try and win a job at the Louisville Orchestra. Sometimes hundreds of people apply for just one single spot. And as I said, they are full-time here. They get their benefits from the orchestra. When they work, we don't just hire them for the show. They work all week, which means that allows us to do things like education concerts. It allows us to do the neighborhood concerts that we're doing this week to take the orchestra to every part of Louisville. It allows us to do lots of things that we couldn't do if we just hired them every time we wanted to put on one show. That means that we can truly serve the community. And that is why an orchestra is important. It's not just for one good concert, one show with a popular theme. It's because we are here making music for everyone and bringing people together every single week.
Well, the term world-class city is so thrown around a lot. I mean, the fact that Prince Charles came to Louisville, I'm sure he probably has been to lots of different places, but how many can say they have a full symphony orchestra composing a music score that was done just for his visit? I think that's the definition of world-class city.
Exactly. That's why when you have an important visitor or an important event like Muhammad Ali's passing, your orchestra is the organization that everybody looks to do something special, to show off the city, to show what we've got. But I'm trying to tell people, saying Louisville's on the rise right now. Come for the bourbon, absolutely. Come for the bourbon, come for the derby, but stay for the city.
Right.
Because the city has so much to do. I mean, it's a place where there are incredible events, and sometimes every single weekend they're all piled on top of each other. This is a doing city. And we need to get on the map for that reason. The bourbon is maybe the thing that attracts people. But as soon as you actually live in this city, even if it's just for a couple of days and you really feel what it's like to be a Louisvillian, I think it's hard to see anything but great here.
Right.
This is an amazing place.
Now, speaking, there's so many things about Louisville. I like the hot brown from the Brown Hotel, open sandwich. And I just found out a couple weeks ago, you've heard of Bib lettuce?
Oh, yeah.
That was originated in Frankfurt. Mr. Bibb. He grew it in Frankfurt. I mean, it's just amazing.
We got a lot of fun things here.
Well, and I
didn't know that.
Talk about the fact that I had never heard of Kentucky Blue Moon until Saturday night.
Oh, the Blue Moon of Kentucky? Yeah, Bill
I love
Monroe
how
is
she goes
from here.
hee-haw in the middle of it.
Oh, yeah.
The composer's from here?
Bill Monroe, Bill Monroe was one of the great bluegrass artists of the middle part of the 20th century, and one of the most influential of all of the musicians that kind of created not only what we think of as bluegrass, but also country music, the influence of an intersection between old time, which is something that comes from the Appalachian part of Kentucky, mixed with the things that we think of now as kind of modern country. Really come together in a musician like Bill Monroe, and it's part of our outsized influence on the entire musical establishment of this country. Kentucky has generated so many important artists. The Clooneys, of course. The entire history of country music would not exist if you took out Kentucky.
Loretta Lynn, right?
Loretta Lynn, absolutely. So many of them.
Now, I know there's different parts of music that are all valuable, but I just love the fact that you heard the bluegrass with that, and then you heard a full string section or a full woodwind. I mean, it just adds so much to it, and I think that's why orchestral music is so important. Now, I know this is compact for the last 4 minutes of the interview, but what are some of the things when you compose music from nothing? Like, try to walk us through. How do you go through composing something? Do you start it with just a melody in your head, and how do you take that all the way to the stage?
Yeah, I mean, when you start composing something, I mean, it's just you and your thoughts.
Right.
You know, so many great melodies and so many great tunes and sounds have already been developed. I mean, if you think about all the sounds that range from, say, the Seinfeld theme, which isn't really a melody, even there's just a bunch of memorable sounds, to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, you have to really go into yourself and use your imagination to come up with something that's authentic.
Do you start with the bass and then you put layers on top of it? Because that's what I noticed Saturday. It seems like you have a bass and then you just put stuff on top of it.
There's no wrong way to do it, honestly. A lot of times people do start with a really catchy bass line and then compose a tune on top of that. A lot of times the melody comes first. There's something that you dream up, and when I was listening to Paul McCartney talk about how he came up with yesterday, he heard it, I think, in a dream. And he kept going around to everybody and saying, "What's that song? What's that song? I heard this melody. What's that song?" And he said, "That's not any song." And he just thought, well, it's my song now. So it could be that. Stravinsky, who's a composer we're playing this very week, actually composed in dreams. He would hear sounds in his dreams and then write them down. And so it could range from that to other people sat at a piano and hashed it out. And then some people improvised it. Certainly Bach would come up with a lot of his tunes complete at the keyboard. He'd be at an organ or a harpsichord, and just he'd be improvising them. They'd almost be ready to go. He'd just write them down later.
Harpsichord is the precursor to the piano, right?
It is, yeah.
That's what was played in Mozart. Amadeus.
Yes, they had a harpsichord. Yeah.
Again,
yeah.
my classical knowledge is because of a movie.
Well, that's a great
Which
movie.
it gets the
yeah.
job done, right?
It's a very good movie. It certainly is.
My grandmother, she's one who had a Gershwin CD, and that's when I just fell in love with that music, Rhapsody in Blue and American Paris. Do you think both of those will be in the November concert?
Actually, probably not.
I know
They're
that's
going to
long.
focus more on the vocals. Yeah, exactly. And we've also done those recently. So I
Especially
did
if you
Rhapsody
have
in Blue
Morgan.
last year, and 2 years ago we already did the American in Paris. Yeah. So we try not to repeat things too frequently here
Right.
because there's so much great
Oh,
music
yeah.
out there.
Yes.
A lot of orchestras, they played Beethoven Fifth Symphony every year, and I thought, well, but that is not special anymore, and that should always be special.
Well, yeah, you're right. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Well, it's like here at Actors Theater always has their classic Dracula and A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, and,
Maybe
that's a great tradition too.
Right.
We don't really have a tradition quite like that, the way the Nutcracker is a tradition for the ballet. It would actually be nice if we did. We're always looking for something that we could create every
I'm glad
single
you
year.
brought that up because I remember I was
Yeah.
talking to Michelle the fact that we used to have a record club. Do you think that could come back, where every month you got a record? And this is from
Oh, from
Robert
the
Whitney.
old Louisville Orchestra.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it used to be part of a subscription. So you'd actually get your subscription of Louisville Orchestra recordings, and we had people subscribe from all over the world, not just here, obviously.
Right.
I mean, we had fans in Europe and Asia. I mean, it was quite something. The distribution of the old Louisville Orchestra records was global.
The last question, I always like to ask this question: Who would you like to thank for you being in your favorite position right now?
You know,
Growing up,
there are a lot of people to thank. I mean, everybody from my parents who supported me, and that takes a lot of work, being driven around to lessons and rehearsals and youth orchestra and concerts, to the teachers that gave selflessly and devoted so much more than could have ever been expected or was reasonable, to the people that, I mean, this is part of such a through line of history. If the music school that I went to in Philadelphia hadn't been founded by a generous donor who loved music and created a school that was completely free for every student, then I wouldn't have gone to that place and met the friends that supported me, and I continue to find support with and continue to talk about all my ideas with. And those are things that get instituted here that then the public sees. There's such a beautiful interconnected ecosystem of musicians, and it spans hundreds of years, if not thousands. So I thank everybody that's all been part of that ecosystem, because it's all connected together.
Parents probably first one, because I mean it starts at home.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. If Bach hadn't come from a musical family and given him the opportunities that he had, then there would be no Bach. Just think about that. That's wild.
Well, thank you so much for your interview.
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Great to talk with you about all these things.